Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Speaking of Resilience podcast. I'm your host, Kate Madigan with the Michigan Climate Action Network. This podcast is also brought to you by the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities. Our guest today is Esosa Aimufua, an associate attorney at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Enbridge is trying to keep climate impacts from being considered as the state reviews their proposed oil tunnel. Esosa is one of the attorneys leading the fight to get the state of Michigan to consider climate impacts of Enbridge's massive oil tunnel as part of its review. Esosa is also one of the attorneys representing MiCAN as we intervene in this case at the Public Service Commission together with ELPC. So welcome, Esosa. It is so great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you, Kate, for having me.
So to kick us off, I'll give a little bit of a background. Most people know that Enbridge wants to build an oil tunnel to carry millions of gallons of oil for up to 99 years. Historically, pipelines have been given sort of a free pass on climate change concerns in part because they don't directly combust the fossil fuels that they carry. But oil pipelines are major accomplices to global warming. And given the urgent need to reduce climate emissions, we can no longer give pipelines a free pass on climate. The fuel carried in Line 5, we've done the back of the envelope calculations based on publicly available information. We know that the fuel that Line 5 carries when it's burned is equivalent to the 3 largest coal-fired power plants in the country combined. Yet right now we're having to fight to get the state, in this case, the Michigan Public Service Commission, to even consider climate change in its review of the pipeline. So will you explain what is happening and why this is?
Sure. Thank you, Kate, once again for having me. To answer your question, we have to kind of start from the genesis. Very quickly, the beginning of just the Line 5 case. For listeners that are not very familiar with Line 5 is a 645-mile, 30-inch diameter pipeline that is owned by Enbridge Limited Partnership, a Canadian company based in Calgary, Alberta. 68 years ago, in 1953, Enbridge was granted an easement by the state of Michigan, which allowed it to place the Line 5 pipelines under the Straits of Mackinac. The Straits of Mackinac is a very narrow waterway connecting Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The Line 5 pipeline starts in Superior, Wisconsin, travels through Michigan's upper and lower peninsula, and ends in Sarnia, Ontario, in Canada. So when Line 5 reaches the Straits of Mackinac, the current 30-inch diameter pipeline splits into two 20-inch diameter pipelines, which I would just call the twin pipelines, and that lay across the lake bed. And when these twin pipelines reach land, they once again become a single 30-inch diameter pipeline. So presently, Enbridge is looking for a way to reroute the twin pipelines under the Straits. In April of 2020, it filed an application with the Michigan Public Service Commission, MPCC, asking for permission to replace and relocate this 20-inch diameter twin pipelines and replace it with a single 30-inch diameter pipeline. And they would put this pipeline inside a 10-foot diameter tunnel, which the company intends to build. So this is kind of like where the case began and how it was set in motion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so in this application, what is Enbridge asking the commission to do? And what would Enbridge have to do to be granted permission?
So in the application, Enbridge is asking for permission to replace and relocate the segment of Line 5, that's the twin pipelines under the Straits of Mackinac. And in order to be granted permission, Enbridge has to demonstrate that there is a public need for the proposed pipeline, that the proposed pipeline is designed and routed in a reasonable manner, and that the construction of the pipeline will meet and exceed current safety and engineering standards, in addition to finding out if there are any environmental impacts from the proposed project and whether these impacts can be mitigated in any way. So, yeah.
And where are we at now in the process? We explain that.
Sure. So ELPC and the Michigan Climate Action Network, MiCAN, are focusing on that third prong I mentioned. That's the environmental impacts from the project. And we argue that the commission should look at the environmental impacts of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change from this Line 5 project. The MPSC will be conducting an environmental assessment, and our goal is to have the environmental impacts of climate change and greenhouse gas be part of this environmental assessment. As you know, there have been a lot of news in Michigan on extreme weather reports. So we believe that the effects of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change should be part of the MPSC's pool of evidence to determine whether the environmental impacts of Line 5 will be what they would be and if they can be mitigated in any way. So at the beginning of this case, Enbridge filed something that's called a motion in limine, which essentially seeks to exclude certain evidence from the scope of a case. So Enbridge argued, among other things, that any evidence concerning climate change or greenhouse gases should be excluded from this proceeding. And on October 23rd, 2020, the administrative law judge agreed with them. So we filed an appeal with the commission, arguing that greenhouse gas emissions and climate change should be considered as an environmental impact of the Line 5 project and should not be excluded from this case. While we were waiting for the commission to make its decision on this appeal, the governor of Michigan revoked and terminated Enbridge's Line 5 easement based on its violation of the public trust doctrine and given the reasonable risk that the continued operation of the pipeline poses to the Great Lakes. So the commission remanded our appeal back to the administrative law judge to consider whether the governor's revocation and termination of the easements changed or impacted anything or impacted our arguments. We argued that the governor's notice makes consideration of greenhouse gases even more essential to the commission's analysis because it changes the conduct of the issue at this case. After the notice, the conduct at issue is no longer for the replacement of the twin pipelines, but rather it is now for the construction of a pipeline in the tunnel for purposes of restarting that decommissioned pipeline. So the ALJ disagreed with us and decided that his initial ruling excluding climate change and greenhouse gases still stands, and the governor's notice changes nothing. So we filed another appeal with the commission last month, disagreeing with the administrative law judge's decision and asking the commission to reverse both the administrative law judge's rulings, holding that evidence regarding greenhouse gases from Enbridge's proposed project are relevant to this case, and that the governor's revocation, the notice, is very relevant to an analysis of greenhouse gas emissions from the proposed project. So currently we are waiting for the commission to make that decision on our appeal. We have no idea when the decision will be made, but we believe that the MPSC makes decisions on in one of its regular scheduled meetings, which could happen at any time.
Yeah, that was a really great summary of everything that's happening. And I just want to really emphasize that the commission is going to decide really anytime now. It could be at tomorrow's meeting, April 8th. It could be another meeting this month. We expect it to be soon. Mm-hmm. And it's a really, really big decision on whether or not climate change will be considered as evidence around climate change will even be considered when they're deciding whether or not to allow this, to give permission to build this oil tunnel. And really all we're asking for right now is to be able to provide this evidence about climate impacts so the commission can make as informed a decision as possible about whether or not to allow this pipeline. So will you talk about the evidence and the expert witnesses that we are ready to bring forward if we're allowed?
Yeah, so our experts are Pete Erickson from the Stockholm Environment Institute and Dr. Peter Howard from the Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU School of Law. It's a mouthful. They would provide testimony, objective evidence into the record that estimates the environmental impact of Enbridge's proposed project on climate change. Mr. Pete Erickson has over a decade of experience in greenhouse gas emission accounting and the role policy mechanisms play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. He would use this information received from Enbridge during discovery to provide testimony and analysis that counts the total greenhouse gas emissions from the Line 5 project, and that would include both the construction and operation of the project. He would estimate the increases in greenhouse gas emissions from the proposed project and compare that to a no action scenario. He will also place that estimated volume of greenhouse gas emissions into the context of global and state public policy goals. So to complement that, Dr. Peter Howard will quantify the environmental, public health, and social welfare costs associated with greenhouse gas emissions estimated by Mr. Erickson using the social cost of carbon. His analysis will basically show how monetizing greenhouse gas emissions resulting from the Line 5 project will assist the Commission in its decision making. And just to clarify, the social cost of carbon is basically a cost-benefit metric, putting a dollar amount on the impacts of climate change. So the analysis of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change can be done, and our experts are ready to do it. It is then up to the Commission to determine, based on this robust record, whether a change in greenhouse gases will occur, whether it would impair, pollute, or destroy the environment or natural resources, and whether there are feasible alternatives to this proposed activity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And yeah, so what we're asking, these are really, really leading experts in the nation who will provide all of this information for the Public Service Commission at no cost to the state, just so that it can aid in a really informed decision. And I just want to say that, to me, Enbridge has asked the MPSC to take a very narrow interpretation of the law that excludes climate change from being considered. And so far, the administrative law judge has agreed with them. And I think this is really, when we're in 2021, when climate impacts are at our doorstep, as you mentioned, we're seeing, and there are reports about the climate impacts we're seeing, and when we're talking about a huge project that will last for decades, I think it's just nothing short of irresponsible to not consider evidence. And it's also, really part of the old way of doing things, of really ignoring and denying climate change and not including it in our decision making. And we're really seeing a change now. We're seeing many leaders starting to lead on climate action, including Governor Whitmer's commitment for Michigan to be carbon neutral by 2050. How has that action by the governor with her climate executive order, how do you think that has influenced this case?
Kate, I think it shows that the state of Michigan is taking climate change very seriously, and so should Enbridge. The impacts of climate change are being felt all across Michigan. We've seen extreme weather reports, as I mentioned before. There have been reports of major floodings, powerful storms, extreme fluctuations in lake levels, and so much more. So I think we need to be more aggressive in planning a future that will look so much better than it does right now. I think for a long time, climate issues have been seen as a political issue, but it is not. And I think it's very obvious to people that it is a real issue that's happening and affecting people right now. So we have evidence on it. It is something that we need to address. So it should be part of the routine consideration by the MPSC or other environmental agencies looking at environmental impacts. Considering a project's impact on climate change, in this case, the Line 5 project, can help us mitigate the impacts of climate change and also move forward and reach our goal to be carbon neutral by 2050, based on the Governor Whitmore's executive action.
Right. And I also want to mention that there's so much public support for the Michigan Public Service Commission and for the state of Michigan to include climate change in this review. There was a letter that was just submitted to the Public Service Commission that over 120 businesses and organizations signed on to, and over 2,000 people in total over just a course of a week, really urging the commission to include climate change and other environmental impacts in their consideration.
Great.
And I wanted to ask you to explain also in your briefs that you have written with Margareta and the other attorneys at ELPC, you've laid out how the MPSC has clear legal authority to include evidence about climate change and greenhouse gases as part of its review of the tunnel. Could you just kind of briefly explain that as well?
Yes. So there's a statute in Michigan called the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, MEPA. It requires state agencies such as the MPSC to determine whether the proposed project, for example, the Line 5 project here, will pollute, impair, or destroy the air, water, or other natural resources. Greenhouse gas emissions that play a part to climate change clearly fall into this category. So since the late 1980s, scientific evidence has established that greenhouse gas emissions have environmental impacts, and the magnitude of those impacts are felt across the state. The most prevalent of this greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, which is emitted in by far the greatest quantities and is largely produced due to activities such as combustion of fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, coal, etc., for transportation, electricity, and many industrial processes. Greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide accelerate the climate change and poorly impact the air, water, and natural resources. As a result, the magnitude of that impact must be determined or at least considered by the commission under MEPA. And I think that failure to do so would be a clear legal error.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, because I've already asked you this, what happens if we get a ruling from the MPSC that does not allow climate to be included? What are our options in that case?
Okay. If that happens, and we really, really hope it doesn't,
yeah,
we would first read the decision very carefully. And if the commission agrees with the ALJ's reasoning, we think that would be wrong as a matter of law. And the next step would be to appeal the case to the Michigan Court of Appeals and get the state court to make that legal determination. At the moment, we don't know the timeline or how long the process will be. As I mentioned earlier, we are still waiting for the commission to inform us on the decision based on the appeal we filed. So we don't know. It's probably going to be April 8th, April 22nd, May 13th, and those are just the days that the commission has its regular scheduled meeting. So that's literally all we know right now.
Yeah. So there are options, and then we'll have to see what the decision is and go from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there are a lot of different things happening, a lot of moving parts in the approval process for the tunnel. There's what we've been talking about at the MPSC, and there are other, agencies that are approving different. There are other parts of this process. Can you talk about that? And also, separate from the tunnel, there's also the ongoing effort to shut down the existing Line 5 in the Straits. Mm-hmm. So can you give us an outline of, what is going on?
Yes, Kay. So there's a lot going on with Line 5 in Michigan. And I think Line 5 is a very important issue in Michigan. And I know that causes a lot of confusion for people and exactly like what's going on. I know me, myself, I always think like, what is going on with Line 5 again?
Yeah.
And I've been working on this for over a year now. So
yeah, me too. It's hard to keep track of everything going on, even if you're working on this as part of your job.
So there are a number of lawsuits going on. One piece is that the governor's notice shutting down Line 5. And she made this announcement, and the Attorney General for Michigan filed a suit in state court asking the court to issue a ruling saying that the notice is legal and is enforceable so that there will be no question or confusion that Enbridge needs to shut down those pipelines. Enbridge is seeking to delay that decision, and they filed a complaint in federal court arguing that the governor's action, even though it's based on state law, should not be decided in state court, but rather it should be heard in federal court. This is a common delay tactic used by the fossil fuel industry to slow down state court decisions that may prevent them from operating. So right now, the state of Michigan has asked the federal courts to send the case back to state court where it should be decided. Parties are briefing right now, and I'm hopeful that we will get a quick decision from the judge, and the judge will send it back to state court where it can be decided. Then there's another aspect in the tunnel application. So the tunnel application is not the only permit that Enbridge needs. It also needs permits from EGLE, and EGLE is just short for Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy in Michigan. Unfortunately, they have been granted permits by EGLE, but the time period for parties to contest the granting of that permit is not up yet. So it remains to be seen if someone or any party will contest one of those permits. And then there's another aspect where Enbridge also needs a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They have not received a permit from that agency yet. The process is still ongoing, and so that's another piece. So there's a lot going on the state agency level and the federal agency level. So it's a lot.
Yeah, thanks for laying that out. That was great. And what can people do to take action and support this effort and get involved?
I think that we have to remember that there is power in our voices, there's power in our opinions and our actions. I think something like sending letters to the various state agencies like EGLE and MPCC, and even federal agencies like the Army Corps, lets them know how the citizens feel about the risk of Line 5. I think you can also spread the word about Line 5 to your friends, family, and anyone that would listen. I remember telling my parents about Line 5, and they had no idea that there was a pipeline called Line 5. So now they're very interested to know, like, there's a pipeline that goes through the Great Lakes. That's weird. When you think of pipelines, you think of like Texas or like North Dakota, but you never think there's actually a pipeline in Michigan. So I think you can spread the word and try to donate to organizations. I think like Oil and Water Don't Mix campaigns, they have a lot of information on what's going on and updates on what's going on with Line 5. So
great. Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned Oil and Water Don't Mix. They're a big partner of ours, and they are organizing a lot of events this summer. This is a really big summer to take action. So you can go to their website, and also you can go to MiCAN's website and sign on to that letter I mentioned, because we're going to continue to add names to that letter and continue to submit it to the commission until they make their decision. So this is a really important and interesting work that you do. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this, working on, landmark climate cases in Michigan.
Thank you, Kate. I really love working on Line 5. Very interesting. So I started because I spent the first half of my life growing up in the oil-rich Niger Delta region of Nigeria, which is in West Africa. So I saw firsthand the environmental impacts and of oil spills and the devastation it causes to communities and economies. Because of this, I had an interest in environmental law and the protection of natural resources. I enrolled in law school, Howard University School of Law, and I took a keen interest in environmental justice and environmental law. And here I am advocating for cleaner air, water, and better environment.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm glad I asked that question. I didn't know your story. All this time I've worked with you.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that.
Well, thanks again for joining us today. Are there any last words, anything we didn't cover today that you want to make sure to mention?
I think that we just have to keep fighting. I think we have to remind ourselves that there might be some setbacks, but we have to keep fighting for our environment and for our for cleaner air, water, and just for our natural resources. The Great Lakes is a very important part of Michigan, so we have to protect it.
Yeah. Great closing words. Thank you so much, Esosa, for all that you do.
No problem. Thank you so much, Kate, for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Speaking of Resilience podcast. You can find more episodes of the Speaking of Resilience podcast at our website, groundworkcenter.org/podcast, miclimateaction.org/podcast, or on all major podcast platforms. If you appreciate this content and want more of it, stay up to date by subscribing to the podcast wherever you listen in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. This helps other listeners find the Speaking of Resilient podcast. Like us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Groundwork Center and at MI Climate Action. Speaking of Resilience is created by the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities and the Michigan Climate Action Network. This episode was produced by Taylor Kramer of Cold Shower Media in collaboration with Nick Loud of the Boardman Review.